Good afternoon. Today is July 6th, 2023. It's just after 3 o'clock. My name is Donovan Carter with the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program.
And Krystin Anderson.
And we're here in Atlanta, Georgia, in the lovely home of
Ocea Thomas.
Thank you so much, Ms. Thomas, for having us today. We really do respect and appreciate your time with us. So I want to ask first about yourself. Can you tell me, you mentioned earlier that you're from Pennsylvania.
Yes, I was actually born in Delaware, grew up in Pennsylvania in the family home of my mother, and went to school at Florida A&M, and I've lived in Atlanta 54 years.
Wow. And what did you study at FAMU?
I was in business education.
Okay, great. And is that what you've been working in Atlanta? Or?
Yes, I never really taught school, but I worked as an administrative assistant. And that's how I retired, as an administrative assistant from the local sheriff's office.
Okay, awesome. So, is your family from Delaware, both of your parents?
Yes. My mother's side is from Delaware, from Harrington, Delaware. My father's side is from Seaford, Delaware.
No, I'm not very familiar with Delaware. Are they near each other, or are they far from each other?
Yes, they're maybe 45 minutes apart.
Okay.
Going south.
Okay.
In Delaware.
Okay. Okay. Very cool.
So can you tell us about your parents? What did they do growing up? How was your household like?
Let's see. Well, I grew up with two sisters and a brother. And as I said, I grew up in my mother's family house, which I owned until last year. It was built by my grandfather, who was a brick and stone mason, and it was built in 1900. So it's one of the older homes in a small town. And my dad worked in New York, in New Rochelle. He worked for the post office.
And your mother?
My mother was a domestic. She also moved to New York. She lived in White Plains. And then she got married again, and her husband also worked for the post office, even though he was a college grad. But you know, most college grads worked in the post office way back when. He was a graduate of Knoxville College.
So kind of to jump, but it sounds like that home has been in your family so long. How did you come to sell that home?
I had a stroke about 4 years ago. So being able to just fly back and forth was becoming a little issue. And the school taxes were becoming a bigger issue. So I felt that, I guess I've owned it myself for 15 years. Prior to that, my brother and my stepfather and I would share the expenses. And I just felt that it was time for me to give it up. Fortunately, it was sold to a family where the wife's great-great-grandfather and my grandfather were friends. So I kind of feel like it's still in the family in a sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. Awesome. So can you tell us about growing up in Delaware? What was that like? What was the neighborhood?
Well, I was little, so it's funny because there's a Facebook historic page for the town of Parksburg. And for the last several months, I've been sharing pictures that I have, and other people, of course, have been sharing their pictures. And one of the kind of amazing things for some of us is that the school system was integrated. So my mother, who was the youngest of 5, everyone in her family, they went to integrated schools. And so over the last couple of months, I shared my mother's graduation picture. I shared her first grade picture, and this was, 1910 or something. One of my uncles was a baseball player. He was a track runner, and so there are pictures out of his yearbook that they've shared, as well as one of his class reunion pictures. And of course the classes were small, but you had 1 or 2 blacks, in each graduation class.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
So what was the makeup of the neighborhood and the area?
On our particular street was our house. To the right was another black family. In front of us were 2 black families, one of whom his father was in the Civil War. And the house next to him was one of the sons. Further up on the street, because my grandfather owned our entire side of the street. It was our house and then 3 vacant lots, which were mainly trees. But on the other side, they were Polish. And then further down the next street, they were also Polish. So in our neighborhood, I would say 10 black families, and the rest of them were white. Many of whom had been there for years also.
Okay, very interesting. So would you say that growing up around that community impacted your understanding of self coming up and your understanding of race?
Not really. I think showing up at FAMU, I'd never seen that many black people in one place at one time. So that was somewhat of an awakening. Throughout my childhood, I always spent my summers in Delaware at my grandmother's house, my paternal grandmother, along with 5 other cousins who were all the same age. So we would go there. We would go to Atlantic City, where my other aunt lived, and sometimes we'd go to my cousin's house in New Rochelle for a couple days. So I was exposed to, especially New York, at a very young age. So I wasn't sheltered in that small town.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Did you have siblings, or?
Yes, I'm the youngest of 4, and now my sister above me just turned 83, so it's just the 2 of us now.
Wow, that's lovely. You said 3 siblings, 2 brothers and 1 sister, or all sisters?
2 sisters, 1 brother.
2 sisters, 1 brother. Wow. So I want to ask a little more about your family history as well. So did you ever know your grandparents?
I only knew my paternal grandmother, who I happened to be named after. And she lived to be 101.
Wow.
in one day.
Wow.
So I think I might stick around a little longer. Yeah.
And do you know, and you met her in Delaware or in Pennsylvania?
Yes,
Okay.
she lived in Delaware, and so it's her home where I would go in the summer.
Okay.
And I did that from probably 7 to 13. Yeah.
Do you remember, when I think of spending my summers with my grandmother, I always think about the foods that she would make and the smells. What are some things that you recall from your grandmother summers?
My grandmother had 8 or 9 kids. I have never been to my grandmother's house for dinner where there wasn't 3 total complete dinners. If you had chicken and mashed potatoes, you would have pork chops and rice and some other meat and whatever usually went along with that.
Wow.
Always.
Wow.
She made pickled watermelon rind, which none of her grandchildren can make. We did a lot of homemade ice cream, hot rolls, which also none of us could make. So that wasn't passed down, unfortunately.
How about stories you would hear from your grandparents or sayings that they used to say to you?
No. As far as my father's side went, they were very closed-mouthed. Yeah, they didn't say anything. They lived on the main street. My great-grandfather and his one of his brothers, they owned stores. And so the corner was North Street and 3rd Street. That was known as Wooford's Corner. That was the name, Wooford. So there were a lot of interesting things that I remember being down there in the summer. There was always like a traveling medicine man or something that would come, and we could sit on the porch and look at the corner, all the activities that went on. So that particular, my grandmother's family was rather prominent in that area. He also grew cantaloupes and sold cantaloupes. My grandfather would go to Philly and he sold the cantaloupes and things like that. Now on my mother's side, my mother was the youngest also, so sometimes everything doesn't trickle down to the young. You just kind of hear it, and you might remember a little bit of it. But her 2 older brothers knew a little bit more, and some information that I've gotten from their notes and things like that.
Very cool. Very cool. So when did you start getting to learn those things?
Probably about, I would say 30 years ago, I started digging into my grandfather, my maternal grandfather's history. My mother would give me little tidbits, and that's when you had to go to the library and use the fish machine, and you're sitting there in the dark and stuff like that. So I learned a little bit, and then I put it aside, and then I guess about 15 years ago I started digging back into family history through Ancestry and that sort of stuff.
And is that how you found the story of Samuel Burris?
Yes. I was actually talking to a cousin, and I told him I thought I had found my great-grandmother, but I was confused because I thought maybe there was a misspelling, which you often get, because the name I was looking for was Flamer, and what I found was Kramer. And so he said, no, that is your great-grandmother. That was her maiden name, Kramer, and her uncle was Samuel D. Burris of the Underground Railroad. So I said, okay, and we finished our conversation, and then I started looking into Samuel D. Burris. Yes, so that was 2014, I think. And one of the things I found was that there was an exhibit that was taking place. In fact, it was about to close in Dover. And so I flew to Dover, and I went to the exhibit. And when I left, I told the librarian that I was a part of his family. So she took my information, and then after that, I was contacted by someone from the Historic Society there. And one of the main things they were concerned with, well, I went to a couple more seminars after that in Dover, but I could document how I was related to him. His sister was my great-great-grandmother. Yeah. So they were in the process of seeking a pardon for him, and they were looking for documented family for support. So it took a couple of months, and by that time I had connected with maybe 20 more cousins I had never known, siblings of my grandfather's brothers. And so I was able to list their names in our support letter for the pardon as well. Yeah. So anything after that, anything that was taking place, I was notified about.
Okay. So can you actually walk us through the family tree to Samuel Burris, like with names?
Yes,
and
yes. My grandfather was Alexander Flamer. His mother was Mariah Kramer. Her mother was Elizabeth Burris. And her brother was Samuel D. Burris. Yeah.
Okay. That's awesome.
And what did you learn about Samuel Burris when you, I guess, began doing your research?
yeah, there was pretty much a lot on record. And of course, when I went to the exhibit, I saw much more. It was an exhibit with him and Garrett, Mr. Garrett from Philadelphia, and William Still. Told a lot about his being jailed, why he was jailed, different things like that. Yeah. So then, of course, I could dig more into the records that were actually, on file, as well as the personal records to connect me to him.
Yeah. How did it make you feel to first learn this history? What was it?
Well, that was pretty interesting. Also, I think the main thing was learning that we were free people of color, that his parents were also free. I have not been able to ascertain how they were free, but I do know that there were more free blacks in Delaware than there were slaves, considerably more.
Wow.
So they may have just been free from Jump Street.
Wow, I didn't know that. I didn't know
yeah,
that.
yeah.
There were more...
And they could be right next to each other.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's funny that you mentioned Thomas Garrett because we actually had another interview with the descendant of Thomas Garrett, Robert Seeley.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Well, I met Bob, I think in Middletown. There was a high school senior who found out that the site of their high school had been a Quaker farm. And Samuel D. Burris was bringing the Samuel Hawkins family out of Maryland to Philly to freedom. Now, Mr. Hawkins was free, but his wife and children were not. So somebody was after them, and of course a nosy neighbor saw all the commotion, called the police. I don't know what they were called way back then. But the family was jailed in Newcastle, and Mr. Garrett was the attorney that got them out of Newcastle into freedom.
Wow.
In Philly. Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing.
So after finding out about this connection, did you get instantly connected to a chain of other descendants, or how did it work with finding other people?
I was already working on connecting with different cousins. My mother only knew cousins from one of my grandfather's sisters, and she lived in Wilmington, Delaware, which is pretty close, maybe 45 minutes from where we were living, where we grew up. But the other cousins I did not know. Connected with one cousin in 2013 through a DNA match. And then I would connect with other cousins as it went down. And I was retired from an airline, so I could fly, often.
Yeah.
And I did. If I found someone that I was related to, I would ask, well, can I see you next week? And I'd fly up and meet them and connect. So I was able to share the Burris discovery as well as the pardon issue. And so when the pardon came up, they asked me to read part of the letter that he wrote from jail. And I also recommended one of my cousins who was a minister. And at the time, his church was right on the Green in Dover. And the Green is where the State House was, where he was up for sale, and where the pardon was going to take place. So he was able to participate in the pardon ceremony as well. And I guess we had maybe 20 people there from the family.
That's awesome. So can you tell us more about what the process was like to get to that day, to get to the pardon?
Well, I knew it was taking place. Of course, once they contacted me, I think it was maybe about February, and I wrote a letter to the governor on behalf of the descendants of Elizabeth Burris Kramer, who was, his sister. And so it was just a wait and see. And I happened to have been in Pennsylvania at the family house when the call came that he had been pardoned and that everything would be taking place. So I let everybody know. I made, I made those little name cards for everybody that I knew was going to be there. and it has his picture on it and descendants and a place where their name could actually go. Yeah.
That's amazing. So what was it like to actually be at the ceremony where the pardoning kind of was given out?
Oh, it was moving. The room was crowded. I'm sure it was crowded when they were trying to sell him off too. So that, to me, was a correlation. I was glad that my family was there. I was pleased to have participated, to have read a portion of the letter that he wrote from jail.
Do you remember what stood out to you most about the letter?
Well, it's always a notation that he could read and write. Now, he could do a hell of a lot more than read and write, because if you listen to what he wrote, he had a very good command of the English language. It's been said that he was a teacher. I've read that several places, although I've never read exactly where he taught. I'm sure it was in a segregated school, one room or whatever. But I think it said a lot about what he could do. You know, the amount of his education, whether it was self-taught or... I think if you could compare, well, I compare his letter to that of King writing from the Birmingham jail. I mean, it was similar. And then also, the eloquence you can relate to Douglas. Yeah, so.
I would say so. And the one that you read on that day, he ended it with, "My brother in the Lord." So I thought it was interesting. I wanted to ask you, how has religion played a role in like your uncovering of the history as well as in your family present day?
Well, there are several ministers in the Flamer family, which of course is part of the Burris family. My grandfather, Alexander, who I said was a brick and stone mason, as was one of his older brothers, who also lived in the same town. They built the church that was parallel to the house that he raised his kids in. So they were involved. I mean, they were churchgoers, and you know, yeah.
Do you feel like, do you have a religious connection yourself, and has that been strong throughout your life?
It has been, but I've gotten, you know, when you make the decision yourself, I don't go to church currently. I listen to the old family church a lot on Facebook. And there are a couple other churches that I listen to mainly on Facebook.
Okay, gotcha. So if we could jump back a little, earlier you mentioned that you had a neighbor whose family was also involved in the Civil War in some history. Were there discussions in your neighborhood or with among people that live nearby about history or about family members like this?
Not really. You just knew that Mr. Wilson had been in the Civil War. Of course, when they had the monument dedication in Washington, his granddaughter, who was my neighbor, also a classmate of my brother's, she and other members participated in that. And so, you know, it was brought up again. But at that time, probably the only person that we ever talked about was my great uncle, whose name was also Samuel, with the middle initial D. He and his brother, they owned a news store in Philly, and they actually owned it for more than 30 years. And he had was known as having a big collection of other black newspapers from surrounding areas, popular areas, Pittsburgh, Richmond. That's where they were from, Richmond. So he was the one in our family that we talked about most. And actually, when he died, part of his collection is that he was, he was also elected one term a Pennsylvania senator.
Wow.
House of Representatives. So after he died, some of his election materials and other stuff was given to the Philadelphia Historic Society, and a lot of his personal pictures and everything like that was also given to I'm going blank here, to the Charles Blockson Museum at Temple. And so I was able to visit there several times and to go through his papers and to really write on special pictures, you know, who it was. He, as well as his brother, they were third-degree Masons. And so there was some other materials in there that I could identify who was in it. And stuff like that.
Wow.
And just to clarify, you said he's also Samuel D., but what was his last name?
Holmes. Samuel
D Holmes.
D. Holmes. Yes.
Wow. That's awesome. Have you learned anything about Samuel Burris or any other Samuel Holmes or any other of your family members that has struck you or surprised you greatly?
I don't think so. Like I said, on my paternal side, my great-grandfather and his brother, they were business owners way back. Their father was also a free man of color. So I come from free people on both sides. Yeah.
So how do you, I guess with your own children, grandchildren, and now great-grandchildren, how do you wish to continue, I guess, the story of Samuel Burris and continue that history?
Well, in 2015, they had, I was talking about Middletown High School being designated as part of the Underground Railroad. Well, they also had a bench by the road dedicated to the Hawkins family and to Samuel D. Burris by, you have to bear with me, I'm getting older now. Toni Morrison Society.
Wow.
So I took my grandsons, well, my grandson and my great-grandson, who were about 7 and 9 at the time. So they participated in that. I was very pleased when my grandson was in 8th grade that he independently decided to be Samuel D. Burris in their living wax museum. And this is that's him. And this was his poster from that. So all of this stuff we actually had, so it was, you know, quick and easy to kind of do this poster.
Wow.
Yeah. So they're aware, and you know, hopefully they will keep being aware, and that other family members will share it with their children and grandchildren, that sort of thing.
So did he do this entirely independently, or did you?
Well,
shove him a few
I gave
things?
him all of the stuff. This is him and his nephew. So this was taken in Middletown at the bench. But he said, I think I'll do Samuel D. Burris.
Wow.
And I was excited and happy that he decided to do that.
So can you tell us about these 3 pictures here as well? Where they're from?
This one, well, that's just him. Under it is the write-up that he did, and then the picture of Samuel and the picture of Delaware.
So I know a little bit about the Samuel D. Burris story, and I know he was an advocate in working to help help enslaved people escape. So how does that, I guess, relationship with, activism or advocacy, how does that influence you, or does it at all? How
Oh,
does it make
well,
you feel?
I've always been an outspoken person, first of all. And when it comes to Black history and that sort of thing, I've never been one to just go with the 5 or 6 people that everybody picks, that you would think there was nobody in the world except Harriet Tubman, Douglas. Harriet Tubman did great things. Well, Samuel D. Burris, I think, was in jail when she first started helping people escape. So there were definitely others before her. It's so the fact that he put his life and left his wife and children to keep doing this is admirable, because regardless of the crime, if you were a free person of color, man or woman, and you were caught, the sentence was 7 years a slave. So that was, really a testament that you had to be sure you could do what you were going to do and get back. But I'm grateful that once he was caught and spent that 1.5 years in jail and, faced certain death as a slave, because he was found guilty on 2 counts. He was up for 3, was found guilty on 2. So that would have been 14 years. And he was in his 30s, so, that would have been certain death.
Wow. Mm-hmm. So definitely courageous and has done many historic things. Mm-hmm. Have you learned anything about him as a person, what he was like, other interests he had, skills?
No, because, of course, doing what he was doing, there were certain things that couldn't be documented. And then other things, of course, is hard to really find. However, once he moved to California, he actually continued to advocate, particularly with the school system for blacks in California. So he he kept on.
For sure.
That's amazing. I think about these cross-country connections with activists and abolitionists especially. And I also found it interesting that, rarely are they advocates not only for just the abolition of slavery, but also true kind of liberal and democratic ideals such as education and things like that as an advocate of education. And how, if you could speak to Samuel Burris, what would you, want to talk with him about?
Probably his family, more than anything else. Hopefully he could answer the question as to how his parents, both parents, were actually free. And my other great-grandfather, Joseph Kramer, he came from a free family also. So his father was free, and that was 17-something. So I think it's more trying to connect the whole circle that I would be asking about, and also why he felt it's so important to keep going back and forth, when he actually had children. And so, he was testing being taken away from his family to free some other family.
For sure. So in your searching, have you been able to find anyone that he helped free?
No, because once again, the only name that is ever connected to him was an individual he was trying to help escape by boat, and they were caught. Her first name was Maria. I can't think of the last name. But I would like to know what happened to her. I think I've looked her up once, but I didn't really find anything. But it would be interesting to know that.
Yeah, for sure. So to the present day, he's been, pardoned, and it's been 6 or 7 years since then. Has anything else kind of happened? Any more acknowledgement or?
Well, once he was free, I was contacted, once the pardon went through, I was contacted by a Canadian, a Japanese newspaper, and I had interviews with them. The pardon was carried all over the world. And I have in my little book that I keep there, I have some other newspapers, at least copies. Yeah. Just let's see, 1, 2, just these two, but there are 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, about 22 different newspapers where news of his pardon was carried. And so I just kind of, took shots and made copies of that. Yeah.
If you could you tell us some of the newspaper titles or where those are?
Oh, and I don't have my glasses on. San Francisco, the Desert Sun, the Tennessean, Illinois, Colorado, and I thought there was, I know there's a couple foreign ones in here, but can't quite see that right now. Mm-hmm.
Feel free if there's anything else in there. We'd love to hear about what else is in your bind.
Well, a lot of this is just copies. That was the first seminar that I went to. The second one, this was in October. The second one was in February, I remember, because it was a beautiful day like this. And by 6 o'clock it was snowing.
Whoa.
Yeah. And that was on using mapping to find your relatives. And the lady that was doing the seminar, of course, I had spoken to before and given her, everybody's name. So when she saw Joseph Kramer, she knew that was a connection to Samuel D. Burris because that was his sister. So she talked about that during that particular seminar. And I think what else is in here, this is the program for the bench by the road. And that was in 2015. This is a reenactment of him helping the Hawkins family as they were coming to freedom. He was living in Philadelphia, or perhaps even Camden, New Jersey, which is right across the bridge, same thing, when he was put in jail. His two older brothers also lived in Philly with their families. So the two brothers left and went to San Francisco first, and then he came later with his family. My other uncle, the oldest of the three boys, William, he was a janitor at one of the schools, and very well respected, obviously, by words when he passed. But everyone, of course, they were buried in San Francisco. Well, the second brother, James, he died in the flood in Sacramento. Yeah. But they were, so he's buried in Sacramento, but the others were buried in San Francisco. And San Francisco was hungry for land, so they moved all the cemeteries, dug everybody up. So he was moved to Colma. So one day I, was on the computer and I contacted the cemetery in Colma, and I told them that, he was buried there along with his wife, a son and one of his daughters, as well as his brother and wife and a couple family members. So they did not know that. And shortly thereafter, I got a call and he asked me, could I fly out there? Well, I was in Pennsylvania at the time. I used to go to Pennsylvania quite often because that was my base to go to Delaware to track down all these other cousins. So I said yes, so I drove to Baltimore and flew to San Francisco. And I was expecting to see where his grave was, to maybe talk to see about any sort of memorial that we could have there, but instead they had a big ceremony. Yeah, so they had a cake.
Wow, a great American.
Yes, and a reception. They had this came off. Oh, it's connected. This came off a a flowered wreath. This was one of the gentlemen. So I took the picture with me.
Wow.
And shortly after that, the city of Colma sent a proclamation. I forgot that. A proclamation because they didn't know he was there either. And it was Black History. So they sent something for that. I have also, as I have discovered things, I discovered that Samuel's son, George, who is the one who presented this lithograph to William Still of his father, that he did not have a headstone. So I had a headstone commissioned for him. He's buried in Santa Barbara. So I have two cousins that live in California. So we went out there and had a little dedication. My cousin's a saxophonist, so he played. And my cousin read a poem. And she has since been back to Santa Barbara and just decided to put a flower down. So I, did that for George. Yeah.
Now, does Samuel have a headstone?
No. The way they're they have, they're on this hill. It's 30,000 little square boxes from the previous cemetery. 30,000. So the way that particular, I have a picture somewhere. The way that particular hill is, there's no way to really have a monument or anything in that area to, particularly for him. But they know the exact spot where he is. So that in itself, is comforting to know that you do know exactly where he is. Yeah. This is, I'm trying to get this picture. This was from Middletown. And that's the descendants of Garrett, Hun, Alston, and Burris. And this young lady, that the designation of an Underground Railroad site was her senior project. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And I was so excited to meet her, and she was excited to meet me. Yeah.
Wow. Well, that is so awesome. Thank you so much for keeping all of these so well and sharing them with us.
Yeah, that's, I find it ironic. One of the representatives who wrote off on of course, the pardon was done by the governor, but they also did a historic marker in Willow Grove, where he was born. And one of the representatives assigned off from that was from Camden, Delaware. And Camden, the 29 residents of Camden, they actually had a law, a special legislative act to punish the notorious Samuel D. Burris. That if he ever set foot in the state of Delaware again, that he would be jailed.
Wow.
So I am sure they were absolutely peeved when they found out that he wasn't bought to become a slave. He was bought to go back to his family in Philly. So they said, "Oh, okay. Well, we'll do something else."
And
So, yeah.
It's like one free person of color signed that petition as well.
People associated with it. So it's just that he was a free person of color.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the petitioners that signed, there was 10. And that was 1849.
Wow.
Yep. So he established himself in Delaware, much to the chagrin of a number of people.
Right.
And this is, that's the program from the pardon. And that's me, and that was my cousin that gave the, yeah.
Oh, that's Bob Seeley in the middle?
Do you
Oh, that's
have
the
him?
governor.
Oh.
Yeah, we watched the video.
Oh, okay, okay. And I still have the pen.
Wow, you still have
Yeah.
the pen.
Cool.
So the governor gave me the pen.
So do you know if in Delaware, Samuel Burris' history is taught in schools? Do you know?
I think it was a little. I'm not certain, but oh, I'm sorry. This was. I did have one that was by itself. Yeah. I'm looking at his signature back here. He actually signed the marriage bond for his sister.
Wow.
Yeah. So that was the first place that I saw his signature.
Wow.
Was on her marriage bond. Yeah, and it was they put
That's
it on
the letter you read as well.
on the back. That was part of it. Yeah, actually, this is yeah. The letter says, "Dear brother." It was March 29th, 1848, but it was really sent to a fellow abolitionist in Martha's Vineyard, not Martha's Vineyard. Going blank again.
Okay.
They sent it to it's something like a Martha's Vineyard. But anyway, they forwarded the letter on to another abolitionist who published it.
Wow.
He was a white man. He had a newspaper, The Liberator. And so he published it. And that's how his plight became known to all the abolitionists and all the supporters, because one person had the foresight to give it to someone who could make it public.
Wow.
Yeah.
So then that letter is part of what secured his freedom.
Probably support anyway, because I think it was a $500 bond and some other things, so I'm sure some support did come as a result.
Very cool. Wow, what an amazing story. Well, I don't think we have any remaining questions for you. Is there any last words that you'd like to share?
No, I just thank you for being here, for asking me the background that I know. Hopefully just spread the fact that of what he did, and make other people aware.
For sure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yay. Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Oh, that's the pardon. That's a copy of the pardon. Yeah.
What else?
So this is a release just allowing us to use the your image.
Yeah, I had a copy of it.
Oh.